Hello, I'm Andrew Weaver from NEHC Academy, the training division of North Healing Center. In this video, what I'm going to do is talk to you about some of the things that deal with vibration. As a sound healer, it's really good to know how specific vibrations move outwards from a vibrating source, like a tuning fork, like a Tibetan singing bowl. As we use devices that vibrate and create a frequency and an energy wave, what I want to talk to you about is the way that sound moves in our environment and what that means for us as sound healers. I spent 22 years in the United States Navy as a sound expert, mainly dealing with underwater acoustics. And one of those things that I had to do is train people on how sound travels outwards. So I'm going to bring some of that information to you so that you can apply it to your own practice. One of the things that I think is pretty important for what we're going to talk about and deal with right now is the difference in the way that vibration works with sound and how that differs from some of the other things that we may deal with in energy healing. Specifically sound, when we're dealing with sound, we have a sound emitter that uses and pushes against and vibrates physical molecules. So why that is important is because there are some energy forms of energy that we deal with that have energy waves that do not apply to the same physics as what I'm about to talk to you today. So it's important to know that when we're dealing with sound only, this abides by the physics that you would expect from Newton's laws of motion and physical molecules, whether they're air molecules or water molecules, is what I dealt with in the Navy. And you're dealing with, on one aspect of sound healing, sound vibration traveling through the air, sound vibration traveling through even a person's body, where there's molecules touching, coming into contact with other molecules, and having a sound wave come out from there. So what I'm going to do is show you what a very typical sound transmission or sound loss equation here. We're actually going to use some math in addition to talking about some of the things that actually happen, the physics behind how physical molecules interact with each other to allow that sound vibration, something that's vibrating like a tuning fork, the tines of the tuning fork that are moving, or if you're going to apply that to a bowl that's vibrating, it's vibrating the air molecules around that device. So there has to be, in the transmission of sound, there has to be some sort of a device that's creating or vibrating, that's creating the vibration. That's the source itself. So what I'm going to do is walk you through whether you're going to apply what I'm talking about to a Tibetan singing bowl, to the tuning forks, whether you apply that to any other device, sound creating device or sound generating device, whether it's a gong or a bell or chimes. It's the same process that I'm going to talk about here. So what we're doing here is talking about how do those vibrations get from, let's say in this case, the tuning fork tines, as it's vibrating back and forth and pushing against air molecules. How that's going to travel across through some sort of medium, in this case air, and then it's going to get to some sensor on the other end. And that's pretty important for this entire equation. When you are transmitting vibration outwards into a medium like air, it's done with a purpose. Sound is what we as humans need in order to survive. We have sensors built into our ears. So we have a sensory receptors built into our bodies, and we have the ability to process those vibrations when they come in to our ears. they get transferred into electrical signals, they get processed. Same thing that I did in the Navy, and that is actually all part of the process for transmission of sound. When we transmit any sort of energy as communication, there's a device or something that creates the original message. In this case, let's say this is a 128 hertz tuning fork. So the message is a frequency of 128 times per second. There is a wave that goes outwards, and as it's traveling across the air molecules being pushed through in a wave, it's going to get into a sensor. Without a sensor on the other end to pick up those frequencies or that communication, then all we have is a bunch of vibrations into the air. So if you ever consider that question that gets posed to people, if a tree falls in a forest, does it actually make a sound? Well, I'm here to tell you that it doesn't technically make a sound, because if there's nobody there to hear it, if there's no sensor on the other end to pick up that communication, then all it is vibrations bouncing around that have the potential to be used for communication. Of course, if there were animals there, they would know that a tree was falling. They would get out of the way if they needed to. We have sensors in our ears. If we were standing in the way of that tree falling in the forest, that's going to trigger us that we would have a self-preservation to get out of the way before the tree landed on us, which is the real story behind a tree falling in the forest. We need to be there as the sensor, otherwise we're just talking about vibration. And vibration and anything that emits vibration frequency, it's all done with a purpose. There's a communication happening where whatever is creating that consistent vibration and frequency that gets sent outwards, there is also a corresponding something on the other end that will receive the vibration or the communication. There is something in that sensor that's going to process it. We hear sounds all the time throughout our day. They're all being created for mainly for the purpose of us doing something with that information. So what I'm going to show you is what's actually happening here between the tuning forks and how that information or that vibration gets sent across and actually transmits across that air medium so that it's getting to our ears, and then we can process it and hear that it is 128 hertz. So I'm going to talk to you about this equation, what is actually happening in this equation. This is a very simple, it will be simple in a minute, I guarantee it. This is telling you is that from the tuning forks to your ears and the ability to hear it, if you can actually hear it, what are the things that are happening along this transmission, and what are the things that could be occurring to make it so where that you can just barely hear it, or it's very loud, or you don't pick it up with your ears? What happened to the sound waves as they travel out? This is actually going to be pretty important, that you're going to apply these sort of understandings of the way that energy transmits outwards in a physical environment, and then you can convert some of those things over to a different type of environment, energy environments that do not necessarily use physical molecules in order to push information outwards. So the first thing I want to talk about is the first part here, the source level. The source level is how loud the original device is that's creating sound. What is sound moving through vibrations being pushed into an energy wave? Let's talk about the air molecules. So whatever molecules happen to be in the air, what we call the medium, there's actually physical molecules that are in the air. So when the tines of the tuning forks move back and forth, one of those tines happens to be pushing in this direction, it's pushing air molecules. And sometimes we can think of pushing air molecules as, let's say on Newton's cradle. This is one of those devices you can see over here. Newton's cradle was one of those devices that some people will have sitting on their desk in their office. It's got just a bunch of metal balls that are suspended on strings, and those metal balls, you'll take one of them and move them out like this and just let it go, and when it hits that first ball, it will transfer that energy in between each one of those balls, and then this one over here will kind of swing out, and you'll have them, it'll just keep repeating itself. You have one swing out, it'll hit all these balls, transfer that energy between each one, and then that last one will swing out, and then it'll just keep rotating back and forth. So this is pretty important to know. We call it Newton's cradle because that the balls will abide by the laws of motion, and understanding that you have molecules of air, you have molecules of water, you have molecules of substances within your body that when you apply tuning forks and vibration, these sort of things are occurring as well when you're using sound equipment. So let's go back over here to talk about what volume means. And these little red dots here are representing the air molecules that would be pushed from the tines of the tuning fork as it's moving inwards. And then on that outwards stroke of the tines, it's actually pushing air molecules, and it will push them together. So in between my two hands, there's a certain amount of air molecules. And as I'm pushing against them, they're pushing together, and they're kind of clumped up. So when you're dealing with what we see as a typical wave form, this is what's actually happening. Is if I took what was happening here on the tuning forks and the vibrations that are transferring outwards, what you would deal with here in a typical XY plot where volume goes up and down, time is going out this way, so it's representing one pushing out of the tine, and that would represent molecules being pushed together, just like you would see in the ripples of a pond. You see the wave forms coming outwards in rings because the water got displaced and some of it gets pushed. So the molecules are much closer together when we see this volume rise here. When our ears pick up that loudest volume of something, of the tuning forks when it's coming towards us, the actual sound of the tuning forks, what the ears are actually picking up is all the molecules that are pushed together. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about source level. The level of volume on that source has nothing to do necessarily with the frequency. Frequency has to do with how many of these peaks are happening within a second. In the case of 128 hertz, 128 peaks would happen in a second. But what I'm really talking about with how much sound can get from here to here, and for us to still hear it and process it and know that it was sound, we need a certain amount of volume. And that equates to these molecules that are pushed together and actually gets thrown in a direction away from the source that's pushing the molecules together. Then when the tine comes, when that tuning fork tine comes back towards the center, the remaining molecules in the air, there's much less of them. So we consider the compression part of it as the volume part, and then whatever's left when everything comes back, the valley of a wave. This is much more, the technical term is rarefaction, but we consider this an expansion, because as the tine of the tuning fork comes back, there's much less air or much less molecules in that space because we just pushed a bunch of it that way. So you can keep repeating this cycle back and forth with how high this peak here comes up. That's your volume. That's what we're dealing with here with the tuning forks. It equates to how hard you would hit the tuning fork and how loud it is at the very beginning when you first hit it. That is source level. So as the source level moves out away from the tines, whatever the source was, it's actually moving out in a bunch of different directions all at once. That's something you also have to consider, whether it's Tibetan singing bowls, whether it's the tuning forks, is that it's never just in one direction. Unlike the band, it's in all types of directions all at once. It could be a sphere that comes outwards. It could be caught in a channel, so it's only in certain directions at once. So what we're going to deal with is understanding that from here to the person's ear, we're really only dealing with, mathematically, this would be called one ray. I'm only dealing with a single point between the tuning fork tines and my ears. So just one look at one direction, that's it. So in this case, just where this purple line is here, the purple arrow, I want to see what's happening with these waves as they're coming through. We can already see the blue lines here are representing exactly what I'm showing here. So every time you see a blue line, that would be the pushing of molecules. The tines come back, then I get a little bit of expansion here. Again, just like the ripples of a pond, they're moving away from the vibrating source. That's also something to keep in mind and to know and to understand, that when energy waves move away from the source, they're always moving. Energy waves move. It's moving over time. Energy doesn't become stagnant anywhere. That's actually just a phenomenon that's going to occur when different waves appear to be standing still. But traveling waves, they're always moving away from the source because there's a pushing involved. So when it comes to sound, that's one of the things we have to consider. It's moving away from the source. It's not going to stop anywhere here. Sound still has to travel, because as sound is very much like this, as you're hitting it onto one molecule, it's going to transfer that motion into the next molecule, which pushes it into the next molecule. Here we have entire large areas of molecules being compressed together and all of it being pushed away from the source. So when we have this volume of air molecules here in one big wave being pushed towards somewhere, we want to get it to our ears, and we want it to be useful to us. We want to be able to hear 128 hertz and enjoy the sound and know what to do with it. Along the way between the source and the receiver, your ears, there are things that happen to that sound to take away from the volume. So the volume here is actually measured in decibels, and that would be equivalent of, on your radio or on your phone or whatever you listen to music, you're turning up the volume, you're turning up decibels. So I do not feel that tuning forks are at 100 decibels. That's pretty loud, okay? But just for the sake of this, let's say that's 100 decibels. I know that's not true. But then there is, out of that 100 decibels, we start to lose sound level as we move away from that sound source. What are those things that cause sound to lose its strength or lose its volume along the way? This TL stands for transmission loss. That is all the things that could interact with the mechanical energy of moving away in a wave. What could cause these compressions and expansions to lose some of its strength? We can look at some of these things here. These are very typical transmission loss situations that could occur. One of them is called spreading. What that means is, out of all the force that's coming out of the tuning fork tines, there's that spherical spreading that comes out. And as we go through a medium like air, sound can only travel so far. Well, one of the reasons is it's because there's so much space in between the source and the receiver. That space could be spherical. It could be caught in a cylinder, depending on what was going on within that space. So it expands. The space around that sound expands, and it has to share all of the energy in between that space. So if it's spherical, the spreading that those molecules have over the space, that's called spreading loss, and that actually factors within the transmission loss. Another one of those things, this is another big term, attenuation, and some of the things that would happen with attenuation, again, this is the mechanical energy that's losing its strength along the way. One of those is going to be absorption. So this will be one of the situations where we have vibrations and molecules hitting each other along the way to make it hit the next molecule. So what would reduce your strength is the heat that's given off with the friction of the molecules. So molecules are colliding like the Newton's cradle. When they collide, there's friction that occurs there. There's friction with sound as it travels through. When the friction creates heat, like the molecules rubbing against each other, when sound energy gets converted into heat, it's no longer moving in the direction that it needs to go. It converts into a different form of energy. Anytime sound vibrations convert into something else, it's no longer part of the communication. It no longer interacts with the molecules the same way as where it started with tuning fork tines pushing against the air molecules. So heat, a lot of that sound energy gets absorbed in the surrounding area. It gets converted into heat. So that's part of transmission loss. Another one is scattering. So scattering, there's all these different things in the air, radio waves and things like that. You'll see when you're driving in certain locations, radio waves, your radio will start to have static and kind of not have the same strength that it did. You may be driving through an area where it could be foggy. So the reason your radio doesn't pick up the station as well is because all of those radio waves are scattering through all of the water molecules that are in the air when it's foggy out or when it rains. So scattering has to do with when you have all of those molecules that are hitting each other. When it hits something, another molecule that's not quite in the right spot, or if it's a different type of molecule, maybe it's something in the air like a water droplet or something like that, the two molecules that are hitting each other and going into the direction we need it to go, it actually hits it like a pool ball, and it kind of glances off and goes into another direction. So scattering is actually forward motion being hindered because they go off in different directions and they're not still going in the direction that you're expecting it, that you're wanting it to. So all of these things here are part of taking away from the volume that's occurring between the tuning fork. When it leaves at a specific volume, you're going to lose volume. So if we started out with 100 decibels and we lose 50 decibels in transmission loss, now we're only left with 50 decibels. Again, it's probably not going to be that great of a loss. It's probably not going to be 100 decibels. That's pretty loud. But just consider that fact. When you start out with a certain sound level, you're going to lose some of it because of the things that happen with the vibrations, the collisions that are occurring with those molecules. Then this part here with the NL, that is getting us a little more towards the ears, where there's a noise level. That's what NL stands for. Noise level would be like you being in a party and you're talking to your friend, and your friend's only just a couple feet from you, and you're trying to keep up a conversation, but you have to keep saying, what did you say? Because there's the entire party, all of that noise bouncing around and coming into your ear at the same time. It's competing for the sound that's coming from your friend's mouth. So the noise level that's coming in to the ear at the same time that you're trying to pick up the noise, the frequency coming in, or actually the decibels coming in from the tuning fork, you're going to have to compete with the noise level that's coming in at the same time. It's even worse if it's at the same frequency, because your ears are trying to pick up a particular frequency and understand that frequency at the exclusion of all others. So the noise level is part of that. How loud is the environment around you? This goes to a term that you may have heard before called signal to noise ratio. The signal is whatever sound comes through that you're trying to pick up, and then noise is anything else other than that one frequency or that communication that's coming through. The ratio, the higher the ratio is, the more difficult it is going to be to decipher or determine the sound that you want, as opposed to the other noise that's coming into the area. So noise level, the louder the noise is around the receiver, you're going to reduce again the amount of sound coming through, and whether you can process it or not. Whether you can hear it, whether you can process it. Then in these equations, these are all reducing the original sound volume. Then you get down to this one that has a plus sign to it. So we're adding back into the equation some capability. DI stands for directivity index. What that really means is your ability to factor yourself back into that equation. Your ear lobes are designed to be able to filter out some of that outside noise, and to be able to turn your head and hear in that direction better than I can hear in the direction back there. It's a directivity index. Your ability to do things to change the amount of noise that's coming in, to put yourself in a better situation where you can hear the sound enough to be able to process it, to be able to know that someone's talking, your friend that's sitting a few feet away from you. If you're able to turn towards them, maybe cup your ear a little bit, that's all considered directivity index. You're factoring out outside noises. You are changing your environment, and also your ability to internally focus on the sound that's happening. So inside of your brain and that process that happens once that sound gets into your head and starts to be processed inside, your brain's ability to focus everything else out and to focus on the frequency that you're hearing, that's also part of the directivity index as well. So then we get to the end of that equation. Whatever you're left with at this point, notice that this is a greater than sign, and then this is your detection threshold, DT. That is your ability to, if a frequency or a sound gets to all the way up to your ears, it has to be at a specific level to be received. So you're going to pick up some vibration inside of your ears, the mechanisms inside of your ears. Your inner ear is going to vibrate and still send its signals to your brain, but it still needs to be above a certain decibel level for your brain to be able to process it. That is your detection threshold. You have a specific threshold. It all has to do with the processing, not only picking up the vibration with your ears. It has to be enough decibels to move the parts of your inner ear that creates electrical signals that go to your brain. Then you actually have to identify the information that's coming through as something that's being useful to you, and identify that as being something different than anything else that you're picking up that's coming in, all the other frequencies. You have to be able to tell the difference and what to do with it so that your brain can process it. So that's detection threshold. So what we're dealing with here again is something's being communicated across. In this case, it was a tuning fork. We're dealing with physical molecules that has a volume level associated with it, a source level. Whatever that source level happens to be, when it moves away from that source, things are happening in the medium, like air, that are taking away from some of that sound level due to transmission loss. then the noise level at the receiving end of it, if it's too loud, then there's things that are taking away from the source or the sound level that's coming in. Then we have the ability to focus. We have the ability to focus physically, turning our ears or cupping our ears. That helps us narrow out the other noise and concentrate on the signal itself. And then if that happens to be greater than, or I guess we can, greater than detection threshold, our ability to recognize that frequency and do something with it, process it, and actually convert it into a useful information, that is all part of energy communication, energy waves. There has to be something there to process it on the other end. Otherwise, it's just information that's out there floating around, and there's no one there to process the information and use it. So over time, I'm going to have different videos here where I'm going to be able to show on how to use this information to apply it to different situations. But this is all part of transmission from our sound healing instruments and how it actually transmits out and travels out as a wave in a physical environment of air molecules, and then what happens while it's being transmitted and what that means for when it gets onto the receiving end. It has to be loud enough still for the receiving end to hear it and process it back into something that's useful.